Nobody posts about envy. The platform is full of vulnerability, the raw confessions about anxiety, about depression, about the specific difficulty of being a person in the particular conditions of the current moment. People are honest about grief, about burnout, about feeling lost. Courage has been normalized in ways it has never been normalized before. But not envy. Envy stays private, gets managed before it surfaces, gets converted quickly, efficiently, into something more acceptable. Admiration, inspiration, motivation, the charitable interpretation that keeps the actual feeling from being named as what it is. Because something about envy feels different from the other difficult feelings. Something about it feels like evidence. Evidence of smallness, of ingratitude, of the specific moral failure of someone who cannot simply be glad for what other people have, of a self that is, in this particular way, not enough. And so it gets managed, gets converted, gets posted as inspiration, while the actual feeling, the specific, pointed, information-dense feeling, gets suppressed back into the interior where it continues doing what it was doing before, pressing, insisting, looking for the opening through which it can finally say what it has been trying to say. Here is what most people have never been told about envy. The conversion is a mistake, not morally, psychologically. The conversion of envy into admiration or inspiration, the quick, socially acceptable translation of the raw feeling into something presentable, does not address what envy is doing. It suppresses the symptom while the cause continues, and the cause, the specific, personal, precise cause of this particular envy at this particular person, at this particular moment, is the most important psychological information you have produced in a long time. Not a flaw to be corrected, not a failure to be managed, a signal from the deepest available source about something you need to know. Stay with me. I want to give you a specific scenario, not a dramatic one, the ordinary kind. Someone in your field, your industry, your social circle, your general category of person achieves something. Not something that has nothing to do with you, something adjacent, something that your life has been pointed at or was once pointed at or is still somewhere beneath the managed surface pointed at. A book deal, a promotion, a relationship that looks like the one you want, a creative project that received the recognition you have been doing work you believe deserves, a freedom you have been telling yourself is not what you really want while knowing in the unguarded moments that it is. And you see it. The announcement, the post, the news. And before the thought arrives, before the conscious mind has assembled a response, there is a sensation. Not a noble one, not the warm flush of genuine happiness for someone else. Something that moves in the opposite direction. Something that contracts rather than expands. Something that has, underneath whatever you immediately do with it, the specific quality of a wound. And then the thought arrives, and the thought manages the sensation, converts it, packages it into something that can be shown. But the sensation was there first, and the sensation knew something before the thought arrived to explain it away. What did it know? Not what you are going to tell yourself it knew, not the socially acceptable interpretation. What it actually knew in the 5 seconds before the thought, in the raw, unmanaged, entirely honest physiological response to someone else having something. What moved in you? That answer, the one that arrived before the management, is the only one that matters. Here is the thing that changes everything about how you relate to envy. Envy is not about the other person. It was never about the other person, not even slightly. The other person is the occasion, the trigger, the specific mirror in which something you are carrying became momentarily visible. But the content, the specific, charged, personally aimed content of what you felt belongs entirely to you. This is not a spiritual reframe, it is a clinical observation. The neurologist would tell you that envy activates the anterior cingulate cortex, the region associated with pain, that the brain, when it registers someone else's gain in a domain that is personally relevant, processes it in the same neural territory as physical injury. The brain does not process irrelevant gains this way. It does not produce pain in response to success in domains that have nothing to do with you. The pain is proportional to the relevance, and relevance means something genuinely specific. This domain is yours. This territory is one you have a stake in. This particular success, in this particular area, touches something that matters to you personally. That is why the senior executive does not feel envious watching a professional skateboarder receive sponsorship, and why the unpublished writer cannot look away from the published one. The envy is a proximity signal. It fires when something comes close to the territory of what you actually care about. And the radical truth is this: you cannot envy your way to something you genuinely do not want. The feeling requires proximity. The proximity requires relevance. And relevance requires that the thing actually matters to you. Which means the envy, however uncomfortable, however quickly converted into something more acceptable, is pointing at something real. Something you care about more than you have been willing to say. Envy is not one thing. Most people treat it as a single, undifferentiated feeling, a general wanting what others have that should be suppressed, when in fact it operates in at least 3 distinct registers, each pointing at a different category of unacknowledged truth. Understanding which register you are in changes what you do with what you find. The first register is desire envy. This is the envy that points at something you want, but have not admitted wanting. The desire that went underground at some point, because it was impractical or risky or incompatible with the identity you had been building, and that the other person's success has now made impossible to ignore. The writer, the entrepreneur, the person who said no to the safe path, the one who prioritized what mattered over what was sensible. Desire envy produces a specific sensation, not pure pain, a mixture of pain and recognition. The specific quality of something being seen that had not been seen. The feeling of a desire remembering itself. The second register is permission envy. This is subtler. It is not the envy of what someone has achieved. It is the envy of how freely they seem to want it. The person who advocates for themselves without apology, who asks for what they need without elaborate justification, who exists in their own ambition or their own desire without the constant self-monitoring that checks. Is this okay? Is this too much? Am I allowed to want this? Permission envy is the envy of the unencumbered wanting, of the self that has not learned to manage its own desire into acceptability. And it points not at a specific goal to be pursued, but at a specific internal constraint to be examined. The question it asks is not, what do I want? It is, what tells me I am not allowed to want it? The third register is identity envy, the most complex, the most worth sitting with. This is the envy, not of what someone has or how they want it, but of who they appear to be. The person whose way of moving through the world, their ease, their groundedness, their specific quality of presence, produces the particular envy that is not about what they have accomplished, but about who they seem to be when they are not accomplishing anything. Identity envy is pointing at a version of yourself that you have not yet inhabited, not a specific goal, a quality, a way of being, something about how you are in the world that has not yet been claimed. Every envy has a person inside it, not the person being envied, the person you have not yet become. When the feeling arrives, the specific, targeted, physiologically real response to someone else's something, and you trace it to its source, what you find is not an absence, not simply a lack. You find a self, a specific, potential, absolutely real version of yourself that has been waiting in the underground of the feeling. The creative self that the writer envy contains. The free self that the freedom envy contains. The visible self that the recognition envy contains. These are not fantasies. They are not the ego's wishful projections of a grandiose self that could never actually exist. They are the actual, legitimate, fully real aspirations of a person who had the capacity and then, at some point, learned to be uncertain about whether the capacity was enough. Learned to want quietly instead of openly, to admire from a distance instead of building toward, to envy instead of pursue. Because pursuing required something that envy did not. Pursuing required the belief that you were allowed to arrive. And that belief, the fundamental, structural, this is mine to inhabit belief, is the one that went missing somewhere. That got covered by the accumulated evidence that people like you wanted carefully. That success on that scale was for a different kind of person. That the desire, however genuine, was not quite proportionate to what was actually available to you. And the envy, every time it surfaces, every time it produces the specific physiological signal of proximity to what matters, is the missing belief trying to resurface. The person inside the envy does not need to be made. They need to be recognized as already existing, as the actual orientation of the actual self, as the direction that has been there since before the management began. The envy is not who you wish you were. It is who you already are, asking to be lived. Subscribe, if that distinction just landed. Here is the layer beneath the desire. The envy does not only point at what you want, it points at what you are afraid to want. And those are different things. What you want is relatively easy to find. Ask yourself what you care about, and you will, with some honesty, get an answer. But what you are afraid to want, the specific, personally configured fears that wrap around the wanting and make the wanting feel dangerous, that is harder. That requires the envy. Because the envy feels the danger. The person who envies creative recognition but has not pursued it is not simply uninformed about the goal. They are, at some level, afraid of what pursuing it would require. The vulnerability of making something and offering it. The specific exposure of a self that creates, that reveals itself in the creating, being assessed, being found insufficient, being given the exact information that the not trying was protecting against. The person who envies freedom but has not claimed it is not simply unaware that freedom is possible. They are afraid of what freedom would cost, the disappointment of the people who need them to stay, the loss of the identity that the responsible, reliable, staying person has built, the specific vertigo of being answerable only to themselves. The envy knows both things simultaneously, the wanting and the fear of wanting, the desire and the specific shape of the obstacle between the desire and its pursuit. And the reason envy is more psychologically useful than most people recognize is precisely because it carries both. Not just the destination, the whole topology, the wanting, the fear, the specific place where the fear lives, and, implicitly, the question of whether the fear is proportionate to the actual stakes, which in most cases, it is not. The fear is almost always a memory of stakes that were real in an earlier context, and that have been forward projected onto a current situation that does not carry the same weight. The creative exposure that was dangerous at 12, when the people whose opinion organized your sense of self responded to your creative attempts with indifference or dismissal, is not the same as creative exposure at 35. The freedom that felt irresponsible in the family system that needed you to be responsible is not the same as freedom in the adult life that you are now actually capable of redesigning. The envy points at the desire, the fear points at the old context, and the gap between them Between the desire that is current and the fear that is historical is where the most significant available psychological work lives. There is a specific category of envy that is more revealing than any other, more uncomfortable, more worth examining, more directly pointed at something essential. The envy that has been with you for a long time, not the situational envy. The response to a specific person's recent achievement. The envy that has been present across contexts, across years, across different people in different situations who shared the same quality. The specific thing that keeps producing the response, that has been producing it since you were young enough to not yet know you were supposed to hide it. That quality, the one that has been the consistent object of the oldest envy, is the most precise available map of the self's deepest orientation. Not the orientation that was shaped by circumstances, not the orientation that was formed in response to what was practical. The original orientation, the one that was there before the circumstances arrived, and that has been expressing itself through the envy in every situation that brought it close enough to be felt. Finding this envy, tracing the pattern back across the years, identifying the consistent quality in the different people who produced it, is one of the most clarifying acts available to a self that wants to understand its own genuine direction, not its aspiration. Its direction. The aspiration can be manufactured, can be influenced by culture, by parents, by the ambient pressure of what seems most worthwhile to the people whose opinions once organized your sense of what mattered. The direction cannot be manufactured. It is the body's response, the nervous system's signal, the pre-verbal, pre-managed, physiologically produced recognition of what has been relevant since before you were old enough to perform relevance for an audience. That direction is yours, more yours than anything you have consciously chosen, because it was never a choice. It was always simply what you were pointed at. And the envy, the old, consistent, pattern-forming envy, has been the compass the whole time. The usual instruction at this point in the conversation about envy is familiar. Use it as motivation. Let it fuel you toward your goals. Channel the energy into productive action. Transform the negative feeling into forward momentum. That instruction is not wrong, but it is incomplete, and its incompleteness is what keeps most people cycling between the envy and the motivation without ever quite addressing what the envy is actually pointing at. The envy does not primarily want to be transformed into motivation. It wants to be heard. There is a specific difference between using the envy and listening to it. Using the envy converts it into fuel, moves the energy sideways, away from the message, toward the action, in a way that can produce results while leaving the message undelivered. Listening to the envy stays with it, asks it the questions it is trying to answer, follows it back to its source rather than extracting its energy and moving on. The questions are not complicated. What specifically in what I am responding to, am I responding to? Not the general category, the specific quality. Not I envy their success. What specific dimension of the success? The recognition? The freedom that came with it? The specific kind of work? The quality of life? The relationship to the work itself? How long have I been responding to this specific quality? Is this new, or is this the oldest version of something I've been carrying since long before I would have named it envy? And what would it mean, practically, concretely, in the actual texture of my actual week, to move 1 degree in the direction that this is pointing? Not a life overhaul, not the destination. 1 degree. The next possible step. The smallest genuine movement toward the thing that the envy has been indicating. The distinction between listening and using is the distinction between genuine navigation and the extraction of the envy's energy for goals that may or may not be the ones it was actually pointing at. Navigation requires knowing the destination, and the destination, the actual, personal, genuinely yours destination, is what the envy has been trying to communicate. The practice requires precision, not journaling in the general sense. Specific directed inquiry into specific instances of the feeling. The next time envy arrives, and you will know it, even through the management, even through the immediate conversion, before the conversion, before the charitable reframe, pause long enough to do 3 things. Name it without editing. Not, I feel inspired by their success. The actual thing, even just to yourself, in the privacy of your own thought. I am envious of this specific thing about this specific person. The naming, unedited, unsoftened, is the first act of treating it as information. Locate the specific quality, not the general category of the achievement, the specific dimension that produced the feeling. Because the feeling is not general, it is precise, and the precision is the data. If you envy a colleague's promotion, is it the money, the recognition, the specific quality of work the new role would involve, the way other people will now relate to them, the way they will now relate to themselves? Each of those is a different answer, a different direction, a different message about what you actually need. Ask the time question. Have you felt this before? About different people, in different contexts, across different periods of your life? Because if the answer is yes, if this specific quality has been producing this specific response for a long time, then you are not looking at a passing feeling. You're looking at a bearing, a direction the self has been pointing at since before the management began. And a bearing, once identified, is worth following. Not because the destination is guaranteed, not because the path will be clear, but because the direction is yours. And living in a direction that is actually yours is different in quality, entirely, unmistakably different from living in a direction that was reasonable. Here's the thing about the envy you have been managing. It has not been trying to make you feel bad. It has been trying to make you feel something specific. The specific feeling of this. This is the direction. This is the thing that was always real about what you wanted. This is the life that was always somewhere being pointed at. You felt it, and you converted it. And it came back, and you converted it again. And it has been doing this, returning, insisting, finding the gaps in the management, not because it is pathological, because it is accurate, because the self's orientation, the actual, below the management, never entirely suppressible orientation, keeps pointing in the same direction. And the envy is the signal, the needle on the compass, the body's way of saying yes, there, that. The question is not whether you feel it. You do. You have been. The question is what you do after the next time it arrives. Whether you convert it again, package it into something more presentable, perform the generosity and the inspiration until the signal quiets, or whether this time, before the conversion, you pause long enough to hear it, to let it tell you precisely in its own specific, personal, not transferable to anyone else language, what it has always been trying to say. Not, here is what someone else has that you do not. Here is what you have been pointing at for the whole of your life. Here is the direction. Now go.